working for the department since receiving his construction engineering degree from NDSU in 2003. He spent over 4 years in the construction pool, followed by 5 years in tech support in the design division. Since 2011, he's been the team leader in the transportation services section of the ETS division, overseeing specifications, special provisions, value engineering, the Transportation Innovation Program, and various other unique tasks. Justin, take it away.
I'm muted. Thanks, Jeff. I should have reviewed my bio a little bit closer before I told Sharon the one from last year was good, because I'm not in charge of the TRIP program anymore, but I guess that's beside the point. Good information from everybody so far. I do have a question for Phil, though, that maybe he can answer later, but I'm wondering when his podcast about North Dakota high school sports is going to start. Obviously, he follows it pretty closely and is aware of what's going on, so I'm just kind of curious where I can subscribe to that and get future updates. But my goal here today is to give a little bit of background on what's going on to specifications. Obviously, we came out with a new edition here in the last few months, in late summer, early fall. Timing of that wasn't what we wanted. It got a little bit too close to our drop deadline, so we're going to try and fix that going forward. One of the main things I wanted to talk about to start off is how we're going to do the specification updates going forward. We talked about a little bit about this last year. Eli Ulmer from my section presented last year on some of this stuff. There's going to been some tweaks since then. We are still sticking with an annual specification publication. 2020, however, is going to be the last book that kind of becomes live based on a specific bid opening. 2014, I can't speak to before that, but I know in 2014, the Blue Book started being used for projects that were being bid in October of 14 and then going forward. And then when we were doing supplements, those always went effective for those October bid openings as well. Based on the new project development concept of the bid ready projects, which Chad's going to talk about here after I get done, so I'm not going to get into that a whole bunch. We kind of took a look at that schedule, how that was going to work for the overall project development concept, and how the specifications were going to work into that, and adjusted things a little. So beginning 2022, so 9 months from now, the effective date for standard specifications will be January 1 of a given year. We never really said when they were effective, other than the title sheet of the plans would kind of have an allusion to the specifications in the supplement. It's very small print in the upper right hand corner. That's been changed as part of this process. So what's up here is from a project that was bid just last month in February. If you haven't seen a newer set of plans, that box is quite a bit more prominent than it was before. That was on purpose, obviously, because it's going to be a little bit different going forward. We could have multiple specification additions on a single bid opening. So we wanted to make that a little bit more of a focal point on the cover sheet of the plans when people pulled those up, rather than sort of just there, and whether, I'd imagine there's people that didn't even know that text was up there, because it was just sort of it wasn't a emphasis point, I guess I'll call it. So what'll happen is that thing changes. That'll be a January 1, 22, 23, whatever it might be going forward, along with any supplemental specifications. We don't anticipate publishing supplements in between the annual books, but that was put there just in case it happens. So one thing to keep in mind as you're getting your projects done from a project development standpoint, is what specification is that going to be bid under. And like I said, those are gonna come out and sort of have an effective date for project completion of January 1st, but the actual publication will occur the preceding fall. So you'll see, the 2022 book around October of this year, with the changes that are going to be included in that. We're still publishing books, physical copy books. We got those in house about a month ago. We did some distribution internally. Filled a bunch of orders from people who purchased them through the website. So if you haven't gotten those yet or weren't aware of that is available. There's a link just on the standard specifications website to go through that ordering process. That hasn't changed from the last few years, to be honest. That process is the same. So annual specification. Well, what does that actually mean? It means a couple of things. This slide here is what was presented last year. And obviously all these years changed because we're kind of skipping 2021 from a publication date. The only thing that's going to be the same on this next slide is that asterisk item about hot mix asphalt, because that's a pretty huge ongoing process for us. So this is the extended timeline for the specifications. This should include everything that's in the book. There's basically a 6-year cycle of us we're gonna go through everything. And these items that are listed here in these particular years are going to have what I'm calling a deep dive. We're putting a group together, multidisciplinary group for all these topics, where we can review the content, the intent, our practices up to current industry standards, are what we're asking for materials up to current industry standards. Are we getting what we want out of these? Is there confusion and stuff? So these are gonna take intense reviews. At the same time, we are still going to be doing those minor adjustments, I guess I'll call them, the things that would have typically been a supplement within sections year to year. So just because it says concrete pavement isn't going to get updated until 2024 doesn't mean that there won't be changes in there that couldn't occur in the meantime as something becomes necessary to change. That's kind of how that's going to look. Obviously, if something drastic happens, we'll take a look at something earlier. And again, the HMA stuff is being looked at on an ongoing basis. And there's actually going to be a session later in the OPD construction series that talks about some of that stuff a little bit more in depth. I'm going to touch on it a little bit what we're doing here coming up, but there'll be a longer discussion on that later, at a later date, I should say. Another thing that's changing along with the annual specifications are special provisions. I don't know if it was super common knowledge, but that parenthetical number at the end of an SP number was the addition of the specification that SP was sort of tied to. The specification that it was the standard spec that it was developed under. So the 1070-14, that 14 was meant that SP was developed while the 2014 book was active, so to speak, or a project that was using the 2014 book. We also had, and that was a project specific one. We also had a few, I'd say 6 or 8 what we called standard SPs. The temporary erosion sediment control one is one of them. It still needed to be requested, but the content was the same every time. The new concepts, the new way we're going to do this stuff is we're still going to have those project specific SPs. So the one that's up there as examples of cured in place pipe. Again, that 20 still represents the specification edition the SP was created under. The biggest change was that we've adjusted the way the standard special provisions are numbered. We took the year off of them completely because those can change. They're going to change annually, and for us to have a bunch of basically the same SP floating around out there just with a different parenthetical number didn't make much sense. So we started calling them SSPs, standard special provisions. So SSP1 is now the temporary erosion sediment control, and that's it's going to be the same regardless of which edition of the specification you've developed your project under and it's going to be bid under. How we're going to keep track of that, because those can change too. They've changed in the past. How we're going to keep track of that is described here. So there'll be a revision date in the upper. This is not the erosion sediment control one because that one hasn't changed. I needed one on an example that actually had some edits. So SSP9 is our HMI coring SP, acceptance SP. So as you can see in the upper right-hand corner there's a revision date, and then there's black bars in the margin there that show which sections have been changed from the previous version. And that's how we're going to maintain those. Generally speaking, these get a little complicated as far as the standards go on what you need to include in your table of contents in your plan set. The table of contents list is important for a lot of reasons. Primary, in my opinion, being that's how they put together the proposal document. Down in a programming division, they assemble the special provisions for a job based on that list. There's a few that don't have to show up there, but generally speaking, almost all of them do. So one other change that and this actually just went live earlier this week. The plans preparation guide website where we house our notes. I think everybody's used to looking out there for notes as they're putting projects together. Had a recent update. There was always a special provisions like sub web page there, but there wasn't a lot of information on it. I'll fully admit that. It just kind of had some general, here are some potential special provisions. We're trying to make that a little bit more user friendly and a little bit more robust as far as the content. So as you see in the top of this screenshot there, all those SSPs are listed and there's a link to them. I'm not sure where the limitations of operations one isn't linked there, but that one goes in every job. That's one of the ones you don't need to list actually, as it notes there in their comments. So yeah, what we've done is we've put some information out there on what sort of the triggers are for including those, what they do, and we're going to work on populating the rest of that down below with some examples. Some things we probably won't, just because they are so drastically different from project to project, and they change so often. It wouldn't be a good idea to put it out there and have people assume it was sort of the same. So might not always see a draft of a thing to look at, but again, if you need something, get a hold of us, let us know, and early is better when it comes to special provision requests. That's usually, it oftentimes seems to catch us at the end and we got to scramble to put something together for folks, and we do our best, but it helps everybody out if we can get those requests earlier in the project development process rather than at the PS&E or sometimes later, because we do want those special provisions to be part of the PS&E review even. So just a throw out reminder there. One other thing on SPs that is going to be changing going forward, because we get questions on content sometimes, and there are a fair number of people that actually work on those, whether it's consultants or even just internally sometimes. In the footer of a lot of most SPs, hopefully all of them at some point, we're going to start putting who authored that, and requesting that others put that in there too. Whether or not that some SPs do get signed, stamped, so that disclaimer is down there, so it's a dead giveaway on who put it together, but a lot of others don't. Like these standards, none of those get a PE stamp. So we're asking that folks put the author down in the footer on those so that we know who to reach out to if there are questions either during bidding or during construction. Just a little thing to help kind of everybody out on that one. My next few slides here are some actual changes that were implemented, excuse me, in the 2020 edition of the spec. By and large, we didn't make a lot of changes. The changes we did make would be stuff that we would have called a supplement had we done a supplement instead of a new edition. Obviously, we did incorporate all the prior supplemental specifications. So if you are using the 2020 book, you won't have any supplemental specifications to worry about from the proposal document. And hopefully, like I said earlier, going forward, that won't necessarily be something you need to look for. The certificate of compliance was one that we'd been operating with a special provision for a number of years. That was changing on us quite a bit for a while. We implemented the forms a few years ago, and that was when we kind of pulled it out and decided to make it an SP so we could be a little bit more flexible on content. So that went back in the book, so that 10601C is actually in there again now. The only change from the SP to the new specification is this paragraph I put up here. What this said before was that we could take a look at these records before installation and payment. That got us into a little bit of hot water with Federal Highway, and it caused a couple of issues on a project where we wanted to actually go look at some stuff, and the contractor was not being what I would call a good faith partner in letting us look at some of these records. So we changed this language to the contractor has to maintain those records for us a period after the final voucher is returned to the DOT. And the reason for that is so that we can, Federal Highway has the ability to audit projects for a period of time, and we wanted to be able to obtain those records so that we can keep those items eligible for federal reimbursement. Shouldn't affect things day to day, but if it does, it gives you a little bit more authority to wield in the field on looking at some paperwork that we aren't receiving directly anymore. Other standard SPs that are now in there, Buy America is in there, the Haul Roads SP is in there. There was another section 101 that I kind of alluded to, the nighttime operations, limitations of operations is what it's technically called. But largely it has to do with working in the evenings, overnight, that kind of thing. And we're working on some revisions with the AGC and some district folks to get that a little bit tighter and not have it, I don't want to use the word abused, but to get it more in line with what the intent is, and add a little bit of language there to hopefully get everyone on the same page up front on what the expectations are with those when you're working either, you know, after dusk, before dawn, or just generally overnight. Chip seal application temperature. This is actually a change that went into effect last year with an SP. It was something that came out of our coordinators conference. It was a good idea. Everybody was in agreement on it. So we kind of did a really quick turnaround on that one last spring. It didn't make it into plans necessarily, but what we did was we put an SP together that did go in some of the later bids in the spring, and then asked the engineers in the field to do a change order. So this is actually in the book now. That SP is gone. Just gives us a little bit better window to start some work maybe earlier in the day or even earlier in the year by lowering that pavement temperature a little bit. Some of the HMA items that I said I was going to talk about. There's 3 standard special provisions for hot mix asphalt. Joint density, which was something that we obviously implemented for the first time last year as a major thing. We went through some growing pains with that in the summertime. We issued a kind of a weird halfways SP where we said, hey, if your contractor wants to do this notched wedge concept, have them use this SP instead. This new one incorporates all of those concepts into one thing. So we changed quite a bit. And again, like I said, this is going to be talked about more in depth in the later session. So tune in. I think it's one of the April ones, so it's a few weeks out. The bitumen testing price adjustments, this replaces a document that was only found on the website. The specifications in 109 alluded to that document or referenced that document. It was hard to find. And it also didn't cover the current oils that we're using for hot mix asphalt. So this new document replaces what was on the web before and includes provisions for the polymer modified asphalts that we're using, the ones with the letter designation in the PG oil grades. So that's something that's out there, and hopefully we'll get that figured out, get a way to put that in the spec book figured out sooner rather than later. And then HMA acceptance, I kind of showed that one earlier without really getting into the content. There were some issues that were decided late in the game on how we were going to do coring this year that necessitated kind of putting an SP together on the fly a little bit to line everything up. So that's what that is. Actual specification changes. These 2 tables are actually in the book. Excuse me. In section 430.06, table 12 and table 13. The only difference from prior years is the addition of the incentive pay factors on these 2 tables, the top 2 lines in each one respectively. So if you go over and above, the contractor goes over and above the thresholds that we had for the old 1.0 payment, so above 92 for our lower grade asphalts and above 93 for our 44s and our 45s, we're going to pay for that extra density. There's value to it for the department, and we're really hoping that ultimately this will drive up all of our densities by having the contractors shoot for these incentives, and maybe even in a job where they don't get one or they don't get one every day, they're still higher up on the density factor, the density scale than we were prior to this change. And we're going to keep track of this in this season, next season, in the coming years, and just see how this does potentially affect our densities. We've got good data from the last 2 or 3 years now that we can compare things to as far as a change condition, and really want to see how this is working for us, and maybe we can make some tweaks and bring up our densities across the board by making that 1.0 higher in both situations even, and paying for additional density. So that's the goal with that, and just something to keep in mind. There were some pilot projects with this. In my opinion, they went fairly well. I think a lot of folks agree with that. So this is a good stroke for the department, I think. 550 concrete paving. Ride SP. So one of the first things that happened when I came over to technical services, about 10 years ago, was the concrete ride SP was an SP. And we decided, hey, we're doing this on all our concrete projects, let's just put it in the book. So we did that. I believe it was even a supplement for a while, for a few years before the 14 book came out. 14 book, it was obviously right in there, black and white. We learned that was probably not the best solution. We probably should have kept it as a special provision for a couple of reasons. One, it sort of interrupted the good flow of Section 550 by introducing the surface tolerancing in the middle of the construction requirements, which it is a construction requirement, but it was so long, it just sort of broke up the ability to properly read that and kind of digest it in a good way. The other thing is it helps materials and research. By being a special provision, we can sort of make a list of projects. So that helps materials and research know where they're going to have to go collect data in a given season, so that they don't get any surprises. And the final reason that we pulled it out is because it was technically applicable to anything that was bid under our book under 550, and to go, to go collect this ride data with, mobile equipment and kind of high level stuff like the DOT has. Well, not everybody that bids under this has that equipment, and we're not able as a department, as an agency, to go do all of that for these local agencies. So we had to pull it back a little bit. So yeah, that's going to be a special provision again, starting this construction season. So if you're on a concrete job, pardon me, if you're on a concrete job, check your SPs. You should always check your SPs, but check your SPs and see if you've got a ride spec or not. There is still something in the book for general smoothness, straight edge type things, that kind of stuff. So it's not completely devoid in the specification, but the full ride spec is going to be a special provision. One thing I do want to add is if you've got a concrete job, request this SP early, because we're probably going to want to look a little bit at what kind of ride we can expect and maybe adjust the tolerances accordingly. So that's and you're working on concrete, so that should be something that can be requested incredibly early. We might want to look at the profile of the road, things like that, especially in more urban situations, to see what's achievable. Next up, some structures changes here. Form removal in the specification was kind of overly complex, I guess. Our bridge division approached us on this. There was a table in there that talked about where the forms were and how quickly they could be removed. We did away with the table and kind of made everything a lot more uniform. So deck slabs have a longer period of time there and a maximum. So they've got to be pulled off within 28 days, but after 14. So there's a window there. And then everything else has have to be left in place at least until the curing period is completed. So something to keep in mind if you're going to be on structures project this year, that those form removal requirements changed quite a bit. Another item as regards pumping concrete for structures, we changed this up quite a bit. We struggled with getting the language right a little here to make it make sense. The key point is that italicized bit in the middle. When they're pumping up onto a deck, they've got to use a 90-degree elbow and a 10-foot length of flexible hose coming off that pump, so that that concrete's not being dropped onto the rebar cage and things like that. We want it to flow out rather than fall out. Everything else, all the other portions of the bridge, the structure, kind of follow the same rules as before. That's what the rest of that is. There are additional minor clarifications in 602. I'd say a fair number of them. So please refamiliarize yourself with those, with 602. But I can say that of all sections. Just you never know how long it's been since you might have looked at something. So take a fresh look at everything is highly encouraged, at least for me. 602. Oh, this is finishing for decks and approach slabs. These were completely replaced. And And then the section that follows these two was heavily revised about curing too. So there was really just too many items for me to try to get in here on bullet points. So look at those 3 sections for sure if you're on bridge decks too, or bridges in general. 650, this was a special provision for 2020 construction. There were additional revisions to what was in that SP based on conversation with the bridge division. That SP is in the book now, so it's back in there with those changes like I just mentioned. And this will probably continue to be revised with our bridge guys ahead of the full-blown 650 review when that falls into the structures category in that timeline I showed earlier. So just something to keep in mind. Take a look over this if you're doing deck overlays. This one was kind of been a thorn in a lot of people's sides for a few years, I think, and I'm hoping that this simplifies things. Compaction of aggregates in non-base applications. So we do have moisture and density controls on a lot of non-base situations for aggregate, pipe backfill being maybe the prime example. They used to have a bunch of weird references. So we'd reference 203, which was earthwork, but we changed the moisture and density requirements. And it just got to be a little bit of a headache to try and read it. So those sections that had those references back to 203 for aggregate compaction, which again wasn't an aggregate section, were replaced with just what do we want to see. So that the example I've got up here, 71404. The new text is just here's the expectation. And there was a couple other spots in the book that had a similar thing. 210 was one of them, where we just replaced this with the intent. Hopefully that makes it just better for everybody to read and interpret and understand what the goal there is. Next item I want to cover is water-based pavement markings. This went through a heavy overhaul a few years ago, if anybody remembers, where we're relying much more on the NTPEP test data, which is a part of AASHTO that does material testing kind of ahead of the game. There was some confusion as to what was required in the field. So we made some edits to the specification. We made some edits to a portion of the DOT's website to kind of address this. What our intent is for water-based pavement marking is the contractors actually have to get their individual lots put on a pre-approved lot list. To do that, they submit some stuff to the Materials and Research Division, they vet it, and then do or don't add it to that lot list. What all that needs to happen in the field is verifying that the lots that are submitted on the COC match the lots from the website. Like I said, there was some confusion. There was some project engineers that were asking for all that test data to be submitted with the COC, and that wasn't necessarily, well, it wasn't necessary. It was already taken care of in that first step of the process with materials and research. So what we did was we cleaned up 880.01C to remove the instructions on how to get on the list. Said instructions for the list are on the website, and just sort of drove everything there so that in the field there was hopefully a little bit more clarity on what was needed. Because truthfully, what you need is a COC with those lot numbers, and then verifying them with what's on the list on the DOT's website. This is actually a holdover slide from last year. I wanted to keep it in here because this is still a thing. And these 2 points are still big points. Utility SPs it's still kind of a new concept. They can include a lot of work, so start early, request it early, start looking at it early, and then it just needed to include everything the contractor would need to know on what to expect for those utility hits. Last year there's a whole session on this separate from the spec top, so this didn't get into a whole bunch of stuff. That's not a thing this year, obviously, but if you do have any questions, contact design division, contact us, and obviously we can help you out as best we can. That is all I've got for my stuff. Are there any questions out there, Jeff?
No, it was a very thorough talk, Justin. Always a lot of stuff going on in your guys' world.
Seems to be, yeah.
Yeah. Very interesting. Okay, thanks, Justin.